The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow over the village. The trees whispered secrets to the wind, and the crickets sang their night song, a lullaby to the sleeping world. But I was not sleeping. I was wide awake, my heart pounding in my chest as I sat beside Femi, the man I had come to love more than life itself. Femi had always been a part of the village, just like the trees, the river, and the dusty paths that led to the fields. But he was different from the other boys. There was a fire in him, a burning desire for something more than the simple life we all knew. He had dreams that reached beyond the horizon, dreams that included me. That night, we sat together on a fallen tree trunk, away from the prying eyes of the village. Femi's hand was warm in mine, and his voice was soft as he spoke of the future. "Bidemi," he said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity, "I want to take care of you. I want to give you a life better than this." I looked at him, my heart full of hope and fear. "This life is all I know, Femi," I replied. "What more could we need than what we have here?" He smiled, that smile that always made my heart skip a beat. "We have each other, and that's all that matters. But there's more out there, Bidemi. There's a world beyond this village, and I want to see it. I want to bring back something better for us, for our future." I could see the fire in his eyes, the passion that drove him. It was that same fire that had drawn me to him in the first place. Femi was different, and I loved him for it. But the thought of him leaving, of him going out into that big, unknown world, filled me with a fear I couldn't quite put into words. "You want to leave?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He nodded, squeezing my hand. "Just for a while. I want to go to Lagos, find work, and save money. Then I'll come back, and we can build a life together. A life that's better than anything we've ever known." Lagos. The name sounded so distant, so far away from the only life I had ever known. But I knew that Femi was serious. He wasn't like the other boys in the village, content to live the same life their fathers had lived. He wanted more, and he wanted it for us. "I'll come back, Bidemi," he promised, his voice firm. "I swear to you, I'll come back." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that our love was strong enough to survive the distance, the time, the unknown. But deep down, a part of me was afraid. Afraid that once he left, things would never be the same again. But I couldn't hold him back. I couldn't be the one to keep him from his dreams. So I nodded, forcing a smile. "I'll wait for you, Femi," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He pulled me close, his arms wrapping around me in a tight embrace. I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of him, the warmth of his body against mine. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to freeze time, to hold on to this moment forever. But I knew that wasn't possible. Femi would leave, and I would be left behind, waiting. Waiting for the letters, for the news, for the day he would come back to me. As we sat there under the moon, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives were about to change forever. And deep down, I feared that it wouldn't be for the better. The days after our night under the moon were filled with a strange mixture of hope and dread. Femi was excited, his mind already in Lagos even though his feet were still planted in the village. He talked constantly about the opportunities that awaited him, the money he would make, and the life he would bring back to us. I tried to share his enthusiasm, but the thought of him leaving gnawed at me. The village was all I had ever known. My parents, my friends, the familiar paths and routines, it was a world that was small but safe. The idea of Femi leaving this safety for the chaos of Lagos filled me with an unease I couldn't shake. But I kept my fears to myself. Femi's excitement was contagious, and I didn't want to dampen his spirits. He would sit with me, sketching out plans for our future, describing the house he would build, the children we would have, the life we would share. It all sounded so wonderful, so perfect, that I almost believed it could come true. The village was buzzing with talk of Femi's plans. Everyone knew he was different, that he was destined for more than the simple life of a farmer. Some admired his ambition, while others were more skeptical. They whispered that Lagos was a dangerous place, full of temptations and traps. But Femi was undeterred. "Bidemi," he would say, his eyes alight with dreams, "this is our chance. Our chance to have something more." I would nod, trying to match his enthusiasm. But a part of me was still afraid. What if he didn't come back? What if the city swallowed him up, took him away from me forever? The day of his departure came faster than I had expected. The night before, we sat together once more, this time by the river. The water flowed quietly beside us, the moon reflecting off its surface like a silver ribbon. Femi held my hands in his grip strong and reassuring. "I'll be back before you know it," he said, his voice full of confidence. "And when I return, we'll start our life together. A life that's better than anything we've ever known." I nodded, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. "I'll wait for you, Femi," I whispered, my voice trembling. He leaned in and kissed me, a soft, lingering kiss that felt like both a promise and a goodbye. When he pulled away, he looked into my eyes, his expression serious. "I love you, Bidemi," he said, his voice low and intense. "I've loved you since the first moment I saw you. And I'll love you until the day I die." My heart swelled with emotion, and I could barely speak. "I love you too, Femi," I managed to say, my voice choked with tears. We sat there in silence for a while, just holding each other, both of us aware that this might be the last time we would be together for a long time. The night air was cool, the stars twinkling above us, but all I could feel was the warmth of Femi's arms around me. When morning came, it was time for Femi to leave. The entire village gathered to see him off. His family, friends, and even those who barely knew him came to wish him well. There was an air of excitement, a sense that Femi was embarking on a great adventure. I stood at the edge of the crowd, my heart heavy. Femi caught my eye and smiled, that same smile that had always made me feel like the most important person in the world. He walked over to me, took my hands in his, and squeezed them gently. "I'll be back, Bidemi," he said, his voice firm. "Wait for me." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I'll wait for you, Femi," I whispered. He kissed my forehead, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I watched him go, my heart aching with every step he took. As the crowd began to disperse, I stood there alone, watching the path where Femi had disappeared. The world felt emptier without him, the village quieter, the sky a little less bright. I knew that I would wait for him, no matter how long it took. But as I stood there, the first seed of doubt took root in my heart. What if he didn't come back? What if the life we had dreamed of was just that, a dream? But I pushed those thoughts aside. Femi had made a promise, and I believed in him. He would come back. He had to. And so, I waited. The first few weeks after Femi left were the hardest. The village felt emptier, quieter, as if it had lost a vital part of itself. I went about my daily routines, fetching water from the river, helping my mother in the fields, tending to the small garden behind our house, but everything felt different. The familiar paths I walked each day seemed longer, the sun less warm, the sky less blue. I tried to stay busy, to fill the empty hours with work and chores, but no matter what I did, my thoughts always returned to Femi. I missed him terribly. I missed his laugh, his smile, the way he would tease me about my serious nature. I missed the way he would hold my hand, making me feel safe and loved. At night, I would lie awake in my small bed, staring up at the thatched roof, wondering what Femi was doing at that moment. Was he thinking of me? Was he safe? Was he happy? The questions swirled in my mind, keeping sleep at bay. But as the days turned into weeks, the pain of his absence began to dull, replaced by a quiet determination. I knew that Femi was out there, working hard to build a future for us. I couldn't let myself be consumed by loneliness and doubt. I had to be strong, for both of us. And then, finally, the first letter arrived. It came on a warm afternoon, delivered by a young boy who had traveled from the nearby town. I remember the way my heart leaped in my chest when he handed it to me, the way my fingers trembled as I broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The letter was short, written in Femi's familiar handwriting. He told me about the city, about the crowds and the noise, the tall buildings and the busy streets. He wrote about the job he had found, working as an assistant in a shop owned by a wealthy trader. The work was hard, he said, but he didn't mind. He was doing it all for us. He ended the letter with a promise, "I'll come back for you, Bidemi. Just wait for me a little longer." I read the letter over and over, each word filling me with a renewed sense of hope. Femi hadn't forgotten about me. He was still thinking of me, still planning our future together. The city hadn't changed him, hadn't taken him away from me. For a while, the letters came regularly, each one bringing news of Femi's progress. He wrote about the money he was saving, the plans he was making for our life together. Each letter was a lifeline, a reminder that our dreams were still alive. But then, the letters started to slow. Weeks would go by without a word from him, and when a letter did arrive, it was shorter, less detailed. He still promised to come back, but there was a distance in his words that hadn't been there before. I tried not to let it bother me. I told myself that he was just busy, that the work was taking up more of his time. But deep down, a seed of doubt began to grow. What if something had changed? What if he was no longer as committed to our dreams as he once was? I waited, telling myself that the next letter would be different, that it would reassure me, but the weeks turned into months, and the silence from Lagos became more and more deafening. The other women in the village began to notice. They would give me pitying looks, whispering to each other when they thought I wasn't listening. One day, I overheard a group of women talking near the market. They didn't know I was there, hidden behind a stack of yams. I heard Femi hasn't sent any letters to Bidemi in weeks, one of them said, her voice low but filled with a cruel curiosity. Do you think he's forgotten about her? Another asked, her tone dripping with sympathy that felt more like poison. Who knows? Men like him, they get a taste of the city and they forget all about the women they left behind. Their words cut through me like a knife, and I had to bite down on my lip to keep from crying out. I wanted to burst out from behind the yams and defend Femi, to tell them that they didn't know what they were talking about. But I stayed silent, my heart heavy with the weight of their words. That night, I sat by the river, the same spot where Femi and I had spent our last night together before he left. The water was calm, the moon reflected in its surface just as it had been on that night. I stared at the moon, trying to find comfort in its familiar presence, but all I could think about was Femi. Where was he? What was he doing? Why had the letter stopped coming? I tried to shake off the doubt, to tell myself that everything was fine, but the silence from Lagos was like a dark cloud hanging over me, growing heavier with each passing day. And then, one day, the letter stopped coming altogether. I would check the road every day, hoping to see the familiar figure of the boy with a letter in his hand, but he never came. The silence from Lagos stretched on and on, until it became unbearable. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew something had changed. The Femi who had left the village, full of dreams and promises, was no longer the same man. I could feel it in the emptiness that had taken root in my heart. But I didn't know what to do. I had promised to wait for him, and so I waited. But the longer the silence dragged on, the more I began to wonder if I was waiting for something that would never come. The wind that passed through the village began to carry stories, whispers that fluttered from one ear to another. They were like tiny seeds, sown by curious tongues and watered by the silence from Lagos. The woman spoke of Femi, of the life he might be living in the city, and of the life I was left with in the village. Days turned into weeks, and the whispers grew louder, carried on the wind like a cruel lullaby that followed me wherever I went. The villagers looked at me with a mix of pity and judgment, their eyes telling me what their mouths didn't dare to speak. Bidemi, my mother said one evening, as we sat outside our hut, shelling groundnuts in the fading light. You should stop waiting by the road every day. It's not good for you to hold on to something that may not come back. Her words were gentle, but they cut through me all the same. I had noticed the way she watched me, her eyes full of concern as I made my daily pilgrimage to the road, hoping for a letter that never arrived. She never said anything before, but I could feel her worry growing, just as the whispers in the village grew louder. I'm not giving up on him, I replied, my voice firmer than I felt. He promised he would come back. My mother sighed, her hands pausing in their walk. Promises are easy to make, Bidemi. But keeping them, that's another thing entirely. I wanted to argue with her, to tell her that Femi was different, that our love was strong enough to survive anything. But the silence from Lagos weighed heavily on my heart, and I could feel the doubt creeping in, like a cold wind that refused to be shut out. I stood up, suddenly unable to sit still. I'm going to the river, I said, more to myself than to her. The walk to the river was one I knew well, a path I had walked countless times with Femi. The memories of those walks, of the laughter and the dreams we shared, played in my mind like a haunting melody that I couldn't escape. When I reached the river, I sat down on the bank, staring out at the water. The moon was rising, casting a pale light over the rippling surface. I closed my eyes, letting the sounds of the night wash over me, trying to find some peace in the familiar rhythm of the world around me. But peace was elusive. My thoughts were consumed by Femi, by the life he was living in Lagos, by the silence that stretched between us like an unbridgeable chasm. I wanted to believe that he was still the same man who had held me under the moonlight, who had promised to come back for me. But the longer the silence dragged on, the more I began to doubt. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of voices from the village. The whispers had followed me, even here, to the place that had once been my refuge. They were like ghosts, haunting me with their cruel speculation. Maybe he's found someone else, one voice whispered. He's in the city now. Things are different there, another voice chimed in. The words echoed in my mind, feeding the doubt that had taken root in my heart. I tried to push them away, but they clung to me, refusing to be silenced. The wind picked up, and I pulled my shawl tighter around me, shivering despite the warmth of the night. I couldn't escape the feeling that something had changed, that the life I had been waiting for was slipping further and further out of reach. I stayed by the river until the moon was high in the sky, until the voices from the village had faded into the distance. But even in the silence, the whispers lingered, like a shadow that I couldn't shake. When I finally stood up to leave, I felt a heaviness in my chest, a weight that I couldn't ignore. The path back to the village seemed longer than before, each step a reminder of the distance that now lay between Femi and me. I reached the edge of the village and paused, looking back towards the river, towards the place where our dreams had once seemed so real. But now, those dreams felt like nothing more than a distant memory, a story that had been told a long time ago, in a different world. As I turned back towards the village, I felt the first tear slip down my cheek. It was followed by another, and then another, until I was crying silently, the tears falling freely in the darkness. I didn't know if Femi would ever come back, if the life we had dreamed of would ever become a reality. But in that moment, standing on the edge of the village, I knew that the silence from Lagos had changed everything. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of my own sobs, a mournful echo of the love that had once filled my heart. Time moved in strange ways after the letters stopped coming. The days stretched on endlessly, each one blending into the next, a blur of chores and loneliness. The village carried on as it always had, but for me, everything had changed. The hope that had once filled my heart had been replaced by a heavy, aching emptiness. It was in the midst of this darkness that I discovered the secret I had been carrying. It started as a subtle change, a feeling that something was different within me. At first, I thought it was just the stress, the worry that had been gnawing at me ever since Femi left. But as the days passed, I began to realize that it was something more. I was pregnant. The realization hit me like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through my entire being. I had never imagined this, never thought that I would be left alone in the village, carrying Femi's child without him by my side. At first, I tried to deny it. I told myself that it wasn't possible, that I was just imagining things. But the signs were there, undeniable and clear. My body was changing, my emotions were all over the place, and deep down, I knew the truth. I was going to have Femi's baby. The fear was overwhelming. How could I raise a child on my own? What would the village say? What would my parents do when they found out? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. I kept the secret to myself, too scared to tell anyone, not even my mother. I wasn't ready to face the consequences, to admit to myself that this was really happening. So I pretended that everything was normal, that nothing had changed, even as the truth grew within me, impossible to ignore. But secrets have a way of coming to light, no matter how hard you try to keep them hidden. One morning, as I was fetching water from the river, I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. The world spun around me, and I had to sit down on the bank, clutching my stomach as I waited for the feeling to pass. My mother, who had been walking in the garden nearby, saw me and rushed over, her face filled with concern. "Bidemi, are you all right?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. I nodded, trying to smile. "I'm fine, Mama. Just a little tired." But my mother wasn't convinced. She knelt beside me, her eyes searching my face for answers. "You've been looking pale lately," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "And you've been more tired than usual. What's going on, Bidemi?" I couldn't hold it in any longer. The fear, the anxiety, the weight of the secret I had been carrying, it all came crashing down on me in that moment. The tears welled up in my eyes, and before I knew it, I was sobbing uncontrollably. "Mama, I'm so sorry," I cried, my voice choked with tears. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know. I didn't know I was pregnant." My mother's face went pale, and she stared at me in shock, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch my cheek. "Bidemi, you're pregnant," she whispered, as if she couldn't believe the words. I nodded, unable to speak, the tears streaming down my face. For a moment, my mother was silent, her eyes filled with a mixture of shock, fear, and something else, something that looked like pain. She pulled me into her arms, holding me tightly as I cried into her shoulder. "We'll get through this, Bidemi," she said, her voice steady but soft. "We'll get through this together." The words were meant to be comforting, but they only made the fear and guilt inside me grow stronger. My mother was trying to be strong for me, but I could see the worry in her eyes, the fear that this secret would change everything for our family. As the days passed, the news of my pregnancy spread through the village like wildfire. The whispers that had once been about Femi and his silence from Lagos were now about me and the baby I was carrying. The village women looked at me with a mix of pity and judgment, their eyes following me wherever I went. "Bidemi, pregnant without a husband," I overheard one woman say as I passed by the market. "What a shame. Femi must have forgotten all about her," another voice chimed in. "Men are like that. Once they get a taste of the city, they never come back." Their words cut through me like a knife, the pain of their judgment adding to the already overwhelming burden I was carrying. I felt like I was drowning, trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. But as the days turned into weeks, something inside me began to change. The fear and shame that had once consumed me began to give way to something else, something stronger. I was carrying Femi's child, a part of him that would live on even if he never came back. The thought gave me a strange sense of comfort, a small flicker of hope in the darkness that had taken over my life. I began to focus on the baby, on the life growing inside me. I would sit by the river, my hands resting on my swollen belly, talking to the child as if it could hear me. I told the baby stories of Femi, of the love we had shared, of the dreams we had for the future. I made promises to the child, promises that I would do everything in my power to give it a good life, even if Femi wasn't there to help me. The baby became my anchor, the thing that kept me going when everything else seemed to be falling apart. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the whispers and judgment of the village would continue to haunt me. But I also knew that I wasn't alone. I had my baby, and that was enough. The months passed slowly, each one marked by the changes in my body and the growing awareness of the life inside me. The whispers in the village continued, but they began to fade into the background as I focused on preparing for the baby's arrival. My mother and I worked together to gather everything we would need: cloth for swaddling, herbs for the birth, and a small cradle that we placed in the corner of my room. As my belly grew, so did my resolve. I stopped waiting by the road for letters that would never come, stopped listening to the voices that doubted me and judged me. I started to find strength in the knowledge that I was doing this for my child, that I was creating a new life even in the face of abandonment and heartache. Then, one afternoon, as the village was settling into the quiet rhythm of a late summer day, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching our house. My heart skipped a beat, a sense of foreboding washing over me as I stood up from where I had been sitting in the shade of a tree. My mother, who was inside the house, came to the doorway, her brow furrowed with concern as she saw the look on my face. "What is it, Bidemi?" she asked, but before I could answer, the footsteps came closer, and a figure emerged from the dusty road. It was Femi. He looked different, older somehow, with a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. His clothes were finer than the ones he had worn when he left the village, and his posture was more rigid, as if he had learned to carry himself differently in the city. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air between us heavy with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. My heart pounded in my chest, a mixture of relief and anger surging through me. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than I remembered. "Bidemi, it's good to see you." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "You're back," I managed to say, my voice trembling slightly. He nodded, his eyes shifting away from mine, as if he couldn't bear to look at me. "Yes, I've come back. I wanted to see you." The silence stretched on, and I could feel my mother's presence behind me, a silent witness to this long-awaited reunion. But there was something else, something that didn't feel right. It wasn't just Femi who had returned. My eyes traveled down the road, and that's when I saw her, a woman, dressed in fine clothes, with skin that was lighter than mine and a look of quiet confidence in her eyes. She stood a few paces behind Femi, her hands resting on her belly, which was as round and full as mine. The sight of her hit me like a physical blow, and I felt the air leave my lungs in a sharp gasp. This was the woman the village had whispered about, the one they said Femi had married in the city. I had tried not to believe it, tried to hold on to the hope that Femi would come back to me, but now the truth was standing right in front of me, undeniable and cruel. "Femi, who is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, even though I already knew the answer. He hesitated, his eyes flicking towards the woman before returning to me. "This is Aobomi, my wife." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. I felt my knees weaken, and I had to reach out to steady myself against the doorframe. My mother was beside me in an instant, her hand on my arm, but her presence couldn't stop the world from spinning around me. Your wife? I repeated, my voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and pain. Femi nodded, his expression pained, as if he knew how much his words were hurting me. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, Bidemi. But things in the city, they are different. I needed to survive, and marrying Aobomi, it was part of that. I stared at him, my heart shattering into pieces with each word. And what about us? What about the promises you made to me? He looked away, guilt and shame written all over his face. I didn't forget about you, Bidemi. But life in the city is hard. I had to make choices, and his voice trailed off, as if he couldn't find the words to justify his actions. But there was no justification that could make this right, no explanation that could erase the pain of his betrayal. I looked at Aobomi, who had been watching our exchange in silence. There was a sadness in her eyes, but also a quiet determination, as if she knew that she had won something, even if it had come at a cost. And what about my child, Femi? I asked, my voice breaking as I placed a hand on my swollen belly. She stroked my hair, her touch soothing. It will take time, my dear. But you're not alone. We'll get through this together, you and me. Her words were a balm to my wounded heart, and I held onto them as tightly as I could. The village might judge me, might see me as the girl who had been abandoned by her lover, but in my mother's eyes, I was still the strong, capable woman she had raised. And that was enough to keep me going, at least for now. As the sun set that evening, casting a golden glow over the village, I sat outside with my mother, feeling a small flicker of hope in my heart. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and heartache, but I wasn't facing it alone. I had my mother, I had my child, and I had the strength to endure. And no matter what the village said, no matter how many whispers followed me, I would survive. I would find a way to rebuild my life, to create a new future for myself and my child. Femi's betrayal was a scar, a wound that would never fully heal. But it was also a reminder of my own strength, of the resilience that lay within me. And with that strength, I would face whatever came next, determined to find a way forward, no matter how difficult it might be. Days passed, and the tension in the village grew thicker. Femi, perhaps sensing the full weight of his betrayal, began to seek me out. He would come by the house, offering to help with chores or bringing small gifts, but I wanted none of it. His presence was a painful reminder of everything that had been lost. One evening, he knocked on the door just as the sun was setting. My mother, who had been watching from the window, shook her head, but I decided to face him. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. Bidemi, please, just hear me out, he began, his voice soft, pleading. I crossed my arms, keeping my distance. What do you want, Femi? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know I've hurt you. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but I want to make it right. I want to be part of our child's life. His words stirred something in me, but not enough to erase the pain. You made your choice, Femi. You left me, and you married someone else. Our child isn't a consolation prize. I know, he said quickly. But I'm still the father. I want to help, to be there for you both. I looked into his eyes, searching for sincerity. There was regret, but it wasn't enough to undo the damage. It's not that simple, Femi. You can't just walk back into my life like nothing happened. He nodded, as if expecting this. I understand. But please, think about it. I want to be there for our child. I'll do whatever it takes. I didn't respond, just turned and walked back into the house. Femi might have wanted to reconcile, but the scars of his betrayal were too deep. His words hung in the air, but they couldn't change what had already been broken. The day of my child's birth arrived with the first light of dawn. My mother was by my side, guiding me through the pain, her calm presence a lifeline as the contractions intensified. The women of the village, despite their gossip and judgment, came to help, bringing herbs, water, and comforting words. The labor was long and arduous, but as the sun reached its peak in the sky, I heard the first cries of my child, a strong, healthy boy. My heart swelled with love and relief as my mother placed him in my arms, his tiny face scrunched up, his fist clenched tight. Tears streamed down my face as I looked at him, overwhelmed by the intensity of my feelings. This was my son, the child I had carried through months of heartache and uncertainty. He was perfect, and in that moment, everything else faded away. My mother looked at me, her eyes filled with pride. "You've done well, Bidemi. He's beautiful." I nodded, unable to speak, just holding my son close as he quieted in my arms. The pain of the past months didn't disappear, but it was softened by the joy of this new life. I had something to hold on to, someone to fight for. As the women left, congratulating me and offering blessings for the child, I felt a new sense of purpose. Femi's betrayal had hurt me deeply, but it had also brought me this gift, my son, my reason to keep going. The weeks after my son's birth were filled with a different kind of exhaustion, but also a deep sense of fulfillment. My days were spent caring for him, learning the rhythms of his needs, and finding peace in the simple acts of motherhood. Femi came by often, bringing gifts for the baby, trying to involve himself in our lives. I let him see his son, but I kept a distance between us. I couldn't forget what he had done, couldn't allow myself to believe in the man who had once promised me the world only to abandon me. The village began to accept my new life. The gossip died down, replaced by nods of respect as I walked through the market with my son strapped to my back. I had survived the worst, and now I was stronger for it. One afternoon, as I sat outside with my mother, watching my son sleep, she turned to me with a gentle smile. "You've come a long way, Bidemi. I'm proud of you." I looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. "Thank you, Mama. I couldn't have done it without you." She nodded, her eyes full of love. "You're stronger than you know, my dear. And now, you have a future to look forward to, a future with your son." I smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle in my heart. The pain of the past would always be there, a shadow that lingered at the edges of my memories, but it no longer defined me. I had a new life now, one built on the strength I had found within myself. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the village, I held my son close, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. This was my new beginning, a chance to build a life filled with love and hope, no matter what had come before. And with that, I knew I would be okay. The future was uncertain, but I was ready to face it, with my son by my side and the strength of my own spirit guiding the way.